So, this is new and interesting, isn't it? We're doing a podcast. It doesn't have a name yet. Maybe someone will help us come up with that. We're not, well, as you're about to find out, we're not that clever. Put us together, we're even less clever. Except for this asshole, he's like the most clever person I know. And I would like you very much to introduce yourself, my friend.
So my name's Kane. Clever, maybe. That we'll see how things go. Certainly not organized, which is another thing that we get even worse at when we put together.
You know what? You're not wrong. You're really not wrong. And
I
I
mean,
don't, honestly, coming to you with the idea of, hey, you wanted to do a podcast for a few years. I have an avenue to do it. Let's do it. Mistake number one.
mistake number two, me agreeing.
It's on you at this point. It's out of my hands.
This has just been an avalanche of mistakes that have led to me staring at two files of notes in no particular order. But no, this will be fun.
Yeah, so here we are, standing on the shoulders of great men like Dan Carlin, and absolutely gonna fall on our face, and we're gonna have a great time doing it.
Great heights to fall from.
Oh yeah, yeah. Whereas Newton was standing on the shoulders of giants and succeeded, we're standing on the shoulders of giants and gonna have one hell of a tumble. So, what we're going to be talking about today in the very first episode, the inaugural episode of the podcast without a name, is
It's a good potential name.
that is a good potential name. What we're going to be talking about is the Greek league system. Now, I don't know how many of you know anything about the Greek systems or the Greek polises. And when I talk about this stuff, I'm talking about ancient Greeks, obviously. But there's a lot of information here, and we can't just leap right into the Greek league systems. We need to go into a little bit of their histories, the Persian Wars, the establishment of polises, Sinoism, and that's going to be a lot of fun, and it's a lot of information. So this episode is going to be more information heavy, more date heavy than some of the later ones will be. That it's just what we need to go through to lay down the framework for it. So I apologize if you're bored, and I guess the view count's going to hurt for that. But anyway, with that wonderful introduction out of the way, Kane,
with
I would
that
like to pass it over to you.
absolutely with that absolutely stirring endorsement. Um, on top of it being a little date heavy and a little info heavy, this is also going to be a bit more ephemeral. We really wanted to look into the league as like a system. Classical Greece, archaic Greece has been combed over time and time and time and time and time and time again, and that's just um, before podcasting took off, and then it's been combed over even more after that. So you really need to find something interesting to talk about. Um, but the league system, as we'll get into, doesn't really have, as few things do in history, a firm beginning. So trying to find a place to stake out a firm beginning has been its own absolute has been its own challenge in and
Oh,
of
you can use a
itself.
stronger word than that. You can use
Yeah.
a much stronger word. This has been one of the most challenging research projects I've ever had to do, and that includes some of the shit we had to do in college. But that's beside the point.
Yeah, no, there's talks about starting, are we going to start with the Persian Wars? Maybe we're going to go back to the Mycenaeans and the Minoans. No, that's too far back. Should we do a presentation on Homer, et cetera, et cetera? But
And the answer to all those things was yes.
to keep things a bit more contained, we're going to start with a brief geographical discussion of Greece, which any textbook will take you through because honestly, geography, topography, soil characteristics are all incredibly important to history, to how things end up developing. They kind of set the contours for what's possible in any given region. And in the case of Greece, they were incredibly limiting contours. Soil tended to be very poor in quality, so when they did bother to settle in a given area, they often couldn't have massive populations, or had to find food sources outside of there in order to sustain large populations. Um, Outside these small pockets of arable land where anything could grow, you have these towering mountain ranges that are incredibly difficult to pass
Yeah, I don't know
Uh,
if how many of you have ever been to Greece, but it ideal living. It's not.
right. Um, and then if that's just mainland Greece, once you get to the various islands that surround the Greek world, you're just oftentimes looking at spits of marble. Um, and so yeah, just in general, the land conditions uh,
They weren't
are
ideal.
not ideal for
Yeah,
a sprawling civilization.
which is funny in the lens that we see ancient Greece as today, as these awe-inspiring builders and wonderful thinkers. It kind of flies in the face of what you really think of them as, but it also it speaks really heavily to the ability to like the Greek spirit to survive and thrive and then become traders and survive in this hellscape, for lack of a better word.
Right. And honestly, the Greeks themselves grappled with this perception of themselves. Herodotus, Thucydides, who are two of the historians that will be, or two of the writers, historians that we'll be talking about throughout this series, often looked at their own surroundings and were like, how, how did this happen? Um,
How did we get from then to now?
and they came to have a certain construction of themselves where they saw their own rough uh, development as what made them powerful. Kind of, we could argue in a certain sense that they saw themselves as obviously not actual social Darwinists, because that didn't exist then, but they certainly had the mentality of things were hard and that made us stronger. And that made us stronger than the other, which tended to be those lazy Persians with their flat plains and bountiful food and gold and silver that they could just wallow in.
Greek men are strong because Greek men work.
Yeah, we pulled ourselves up by our sandal straps and did the hard work of turning these mountains fertile. And when that didn't work, we then started trading.
And God's help us, we are great. There is a certain amount of idealism in there. You're right. Very much, not to use an American expression, but like city on the hill.
Yeah,
Um, and literally city on the hill, as some of the cities were. But
you'd have
one of
to.
the sorry,
You'd have to. There's not that much arable land. You couldn't build your city in the fertile plain. You would starve yourselves.
I mean, that's a big brain play right there. But one of the things that we're going to also have to talk about is how these cities, what we would understand as Greek cities, although if you looked at them today, they'd be a medium-sized town. Some of them were metropolises, but nothing on the scale of what we understand as today.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that's really, really important to understand is the process of Sinoikism. And the process of Sinoikism, it literally means to come together, like merging villages into a larger city. And why this is really important, as Kane was pointing out, was that the conditions were just horrible. Almost everything about living in Greece was terrible. So one of the things that would happen is village A would be fighting with village B, but then village C is like, hey, if I side with village A, then we can take down village B, and it builds an alliance. And this is something we're going to see. It's going to be a common theme, really common, where you'll have reciprocity treaties basically, and those are going to build into larger things. And a lot of the times, you'll out of those treaties, you get common founding myths, common cultures, because most of the Greek peninsula spoke the same language. Most Macedon's weird, and well, Macedon and Illyria, if I'm not mistaken, I think Illyria spoke a different dialect. I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. We're not talking about the dirty Illyrians anyway. So, what would happen here is that these common defense treaties would usually lead into, as I said, Sinoikism, and this Sinoikism led to very powerful city states: Sparta, Athens, later Corinth, down the road. And one of the things that we also have to understand about Kane, I'm going to have to bring this up because you wrote it in our notes page, and I love this, is the fact that at this time, when we're talking about like around the year 400 BC and earlier, there were lions in Greece, actual lions. So, I mean, when we see, these European, okay, late Europeans full of shit, but the early European stuff that being the Greeks depicting lions and stuff, they're not that far off,
Yeah,
really
no,
and truthfully.
there were packs of lions hiding in those mountains that were impossible to pass. Already impossible to pass, made doubly so because you might get ambushed by lions. So,
A, a friggin' pride of lions.
uh,
Lion King did not happen in the savannah; it happened in Greece.
right. And kind of to your Sinoikism point, it's actually really interesting how that process goes out. So most Greek city-states, to kind of illustrate the point, most Greek city-states would have their villages ally in that system and would build cities the way we would recognize them. You know, Athens with its marble monuments and that kind of thing, like legitimate metropolises that we could recognize. But what made Sparta different and what is like explicitly highlighted in some of the texts we look at is that they really kept their village structure. Thucydides talks about how if you were to look if you were to look at the ruins of Sparta and Athens, you would never think that Sparta had been anything great because it just looks like a collection of villages. They never took the additional step of, um, making a big city out of themselves. Whereas Athens would have probably seemed far greater than it had ever been because of all the marble structures that they built, because they went all out to make themselves look as pretty as possible, essentially.
It was very opulent.
Yeah. And it's just interesting in terms of like highlighting exactly what Sinoikism is, where Sparta can be considered a city, but really, if you had seen it at the time of the 6th century, the 5th century, the era that we're covering, BC, um, it would have just looked like essentially what we would recognize as like not urban sprawl, but like suburban sprawl, just a
Yeah,
bunch of villages.
very very much the suburbs. I mean, even when you look at, I've never been to Sparta, but even when you look at pictures of Sparta, of what is now Sparta, it's still it's not Athens.
Right.
It's not even what's left of Corinth. It is completely different. From the pictures at least, and what Google Earth tells me, Street View.
Why do you need
It's
to go anywhere, right? You just have Google Earth.
Yeah, lockdowns treat me great. I've been everywhere. Um, but even now, it's not a Rome. Although I don't think that's a fair comparison. It's not a Rome. It's not an
No, I'd say
Athens.
that's not fair.
It's not the same thing. It's still a very small town, but that's what it was always supposed to be. Um,
Right.
oh,
And
sorry.
yeah, and actually just going further from that, that kind of divide of Athenian opulence and other Greek cities' opulence and Sparta's mutedness, with the exception of violence, um,
And their wit.
and their wit, it kind of goes in a bunch of different sources. So, for example, a lot of our written sources are coming from the Ionian Coast, which is modern day Turkey, the coast of Turkey,
Yeah.
or what we could call Anatolia. um, Athens, Thebes, those other city states. Sparta's writing next to nothing. I think we have a few snips of poetry, and that's all we have about Sparta from Spartan's point of view. Whereas, Athens is writing tons of things, and they're having other philosophers and poets and so on from other city states writing things on their behalf. So they have an overwhelming preponderance on the sources, where Sparta gets next to nothing. I had a third point. You're supposed to do these things in rules of three. Uh,
Okay, it's okay. We got time. I
in
mean,
the
I
so yeah, there's the written sources. There's not very much. The archaeological sources, there's not very much because they kept a village structure. Like there's tons to find, no doubt, uh, but it's no Athens. Um,
it's no Thebes. It's no Olympus. It's not it,
oh,
Olympia. Excuse me.
and in terms of coinage and that kind of stuff, there's also very little to find because they just had these giant iron rods to trade around. They deliberately made it not fun to keep their money.
Hey, they had a very good understanding of economics, if that's the case. But I think that's a great segue into the Ionian Coast because that's something that we need to talk about. Is that what the hell was going on in Turkey that made the rise of the league system so important. Now, I know for some filthy casuals out there, it might seem really weird to talk about ancient Greece and then do some really awkward ass segue into ancient Turkey. Well, fuck you, it's our podcast. Um, so what happened is that there were some, as we could understand them, Proto-Greeks living in Ionia, which, as Kane described, is on the Greek coast. It's on the oh man, I'm about to embarrass myself. It's not the Aegean, it's the Ionian Sea. They're on the Ionian Sea. I'm not, I'm pretty sure about that one.
I'm gonna
So
double check that one.
he's got to fact check me. So what happened is that there were these small cities live on the Ionian coast. Now, if you know anything about the Iliad or Homer in general, and I'm not talking about Homer Simpson, I'm talking about Homer the writer. He he. Oh, by the way, am I right?
Um, Give me one. There is an Ionian Sea. I'm looking at where it's located.
Oh, I hope I'm right because this will be bad.
I think you were right with Aegean.
No, I think that doesn't matter. We'll come back to that. This isn't a geography podcast. It might be one day, but for now, it's not. So, what happened is there were these collection of cities on the Ionian coast that identified themselves very strongly with the Greeks. The Greeks basically, I don't want to overstate here, but it's a very complex and complicated issue, and basically the Persians who were in charge of the area took issue with one Ionian man going from city to city, stirring up shit. And what he was doing is he was trying to incite revolt against the Persians. Now, the Persians ran their massive empire. It sprawled from modern day, not almost India and Afghanistan, right up on into Turkey. It was big. It was sorry.
I think they were in India. I think they
Were they
got
in India
a bit into it. Yeah, at
by
least.
this point?
Who knows what Herodotus is talking about, but he seems to think that they were in India.
Okay, we'll take that. So pretty fucking big. And one of the things that is
Actually, just
really
one thing here, just with regards to imperial borders, it is worth stressing that borders as a concept were kind of fluid in these time periods. Um, so, like the official, like hard and fast borders of Persia wasn't really a thing. There was the Persian heartland, and then the variety of locations that were giving tribute, and whether these tributes, like certain tributaries, were explicitly part of Persia, and some tributaries were just giving tribute to Persia, and sometimes you had to give troops. So there's a lot of bleeding space that could go from this is definitely Persia to this is definitely not Persia.
yeah, it is. Oh, sorry, Kane. Yeah, no, you're right. It's a very complicated issue, and the idea of like hard lines on a map is something that's completely foreign to the people in question we're talking about. Like you said, it was very much this city and the space around this city belongs to this group, back out east or something like that. It wasn't. They didn't actually sit down on a map. Maps were even then a foreign concept for a lot of people, where it was oh, our borders extend 12 miles out this way. No one was actually doing that. Basically, what happened is there was a bunch of revolts in Ionia, and that did not sit well with the Persians. And the reason is because the Persians were very laissez-faire, very hands-off when it came to Turkey because it was so far away. It was so far away for them. They looked at it as we're getting boatloads of cash from here. Why screw with it if it works? So they didn't. But then what happened is freedom, all that good stuff, and boom, boom, you have some massive revolts, and that started the wars of the Ionian Revolts, or just the Ionian Revolts. And for some people, some historians and classicists, this is the start of the Greco-Persian Wars. I don't know if I'm willing to go that far. I mean, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but sure, why not? Well, for our purposes here, it's the start of the Greco-Persian, at least conflicts.
Yeah, it's definitely an inciting incident. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you have these Ionian cities, they revolt against Persia, they stop giving tribute, so Persia decides it's going to be a bit more hands-on in this region now. It can't, if the Ionian city-states aren't going to behave, Persia's going to make them behave. And so they need to turn to get some help if they want any chance of surviving as free and independent polities. So they turn to the two powers that exist that might be able to help them. In this era, it's newly democratic Athens and Sparta. Sparta has its own issues. It perpetually has its own issues. We'll probably get into that later.
Oh, we will.
So they just flat out say no. Meanwhile, Athens does send a small fleet to help the Ionians in their revolt. And at first, it's very successful. They lead an attack on the city of Sardis.
Yeah, it was Sardis.
It was Sardis, which was the capital of the satrapy of Lydia at that time.
Satrapies, oh, you want to say it?
Nah, you go for it.
Okay, sorry. Satrapies are, if you think of a modern country, they're like provinces or states or some other division of land that I'm not aware of. Basically, that's what it is. You have an area, you have a satrap or governor. They're in charge of the satrapy. Kane, sorry, continue.
So this is like the regional capital for Persia. It gets completely burnt down, if I recall correctly.
I believe it does, yeah.
They also burnt down like a temple or something, which really pissed off the Persians. And so, spoiler alert, when the Persians invade, they make it a point of burning a number of religious sites throughout Greece. The text we look at stress that as important because of religious desecrations. This was a world in which they avidly believed gods and monsters were walking about causing a ruckus. So this was an important stressor, even if it doesn't necessarily seem all that important to us besides like propaganda utility. So they burned down Sardis. They quickly exunt. Athens stops supporting the Ionians from that point on. And this is kind of attributed to like the fickleness of Athenian democracy, which is its own theme that permeates history. A lot of Athenians didn't like that they lived in a democracy. They much preferred Sparta's system, which had a lot of oligarchical rule and had its own kings to mediate the rabble as they saw it. So Athens stopped supporting the Ionians, and then the Ionians are one by one crushed by the Persians. Some like cities in Ionia commit mass suicide to not lose their freedom. Others are a bit less extreme and just leave, go and settle in like Italy or Sicily or North Africa, locations such as that. One city-state which is located on Isthmus, attempts to sever itself from the coast of Anatolia just to become an island. And it's stopped by an oracle who says, if Zeus wanted you to be an island, you guys would be an island. And so they just leave. And a few others just plain old submit, because it is worth stressing that the Persians, from like a rhetorical standpoint, yes, you were enslaved, you were under the dominion of the Persians, but what that actually meant in effect was religious toleration. Sometimes you would have a tyrant enforced on you. There were a number of times, as we'll see in the Persian Wars, where they would let the Ionians rule themselves however they wanted, and occasional tribute. So it really wasn't.
It's just who's collecting your taxes. Let's be real.
Yeah.
For not for everyone. Don't get me wrong. I'm not generalizing here, but for the ones that submitted, that's what it basically came down to.
Yeah.
But in total, the Ionian Revolts went on for quite a while. It was 499 to 449 BC. So that's 50 years. This is a sizable amount of time. Another thing I just want to stress, and it's not written in our notes, Kane, if you'll allow me this liberty, is that warfare at this period is very, very different. The Persian Wars are going to evolve again, but this is something important to understand for right now, at least. You didn't go to war in the winter. You did not go to war in the winter, and you went to war in the summer. And the reason is because you harvested whatever crops you harvested your spring crops in the spring. You harvested in the fall. If and winter's fucking cold. There's I mean, it's true. So you basically you went on your summer vacation, you killed a bunch of people, and you went home. You saw your family, probably lost an arm or something, and then you continued on with your life until the next campaigning season. That does change with the Persian War. That becomes more of an all-year type of thing. But even then, we do see noticeable dips in the winters, and that's a common theme, like right up till God, like like it was weird for Napoleon to be fighting in the winter. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah, no,
So
even in World War One, at least the Russian campaigns, which I guess is understandable because it's Russia, it was always surprising if something happened in the winter.
yeah, it really and truthfully World War II and maybe the Spanish Civil War, if we want to get really technical, are are really the catalysts that change that. But what topic for another day. The important thing to understand is that the important thing to understand is that warfare in at this time was seasonal. It was very seasonal, mostly because clothing was seasonal and food. And that was the big reasons. Food, i.e., the harvest, and keep warm in the winter. It's not worth it. So that's what you would do. You would siege a city for like 7 years, and every summer you would come back and siege the city and hope you would do enough damage to their crops that they wouldn't be able to harvest in the spring, and that you eventually starve them out. It worked surprisingly, but for the Ionian revolts, so in that 50-year span, it's a number that's kind of surprising. And Kane, this might surprise you. 300,000 dead. That's our estimated numbers.
Jeez.
Yeah, that's an insane amount. Because if you remember, we're talking about cities here that have a maximum population of
Tens
fifty
of
thousand.
thousands, yeah.
Yeah. Like that's insane.
Um, yeah, just going back to your. We good?
Yeah, I'm still here. I haven't gone anywhere.
Okay, you froze for a second. Going
No,
back to your
I think I physically froze. I don't think my camera froze.
going back to your digression on warfare and the nature of it, which definitely should have been in my notes. Bad me. Um, not only was it seasonal, but there could often be like active warfare between two entities, and they're just not doing anything for a couple decades. Uh, you know, Persia didn't make peace with the Greek city states when it left after its first invasion, which we will get to. I keep foreshadowing it, but we are going to get to it in its own time.
Before the end of this episode, we're going to get to it.
But there would be decades of just inaction where Darius is gathering his army and putting down a revolt in Egypt. Persia's a big place. There's always something to do, lots of borders to be minded. So, yeah, there could be huge gaps of actual violence during long active periods of warfare. And then there would be um, just small but momentous fights that would like change the whole course of the war. Thucydides talks about this in his differentiation between the era he lived in and the era that came before. The Persian Wars are decided by like 4 battles, whereas he went through cataclysmic battles every season, it seemed like.
Well, if you had the manpower to do it.
Yeah. And so this is just another distinction to keep in mind when we try and imagine this period. But now to actually get to some conversation of leagues. So we have this overbearing Persia that's looking down on the Greeks. Why could the Ionians have expected help from their fellow Greeks? There is a certain like survivability calculation going on where, oh, if the Ionians lose, we're next on the list. But there's also the idea of commonality amongst all these powers. Amongst all these city states, they were independent, they were separate, but they did speak. They did speak the same language. They worshipped the same gods. They participated in the same pan-Hellenic games. There were pan-Hellenic temples where all of them were welcome to do their worship. All these things kind of created a common identity.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I think you left out the biggest one of all too. Like the absolute biggest thing, the trade.
Also, huge amounts of trade. I thought you were going to say they also exercise naked, all of them, and that's what made them different.
Well, we got to protect our naked brothers. Like, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Who else will fight with us naked if the Persians take the Ionians? This was the most important question the Greeks were discussing amongst themselves.
The greatest rallying cry history has ever seen.
Dicks out for Ionia.
Oh man, I want to make that a T-shirt.
Um, I lost. So there is this common framework from which the Greek city-states could at least communicate with each other and could expect a certain reciprocity from each other. But there is also at this time the big bad boy in Peloponnesia, Sparta, which was in the at that moment fomenting its own, like creating its own genuine league. And the reason why it was creating a league kind of deals with the fact that there was always shit going down in Sparta. Sparta was always busy. Sparta regularly could not go help and fight even its closest allies, and that's because it was sitting on a massive array of slaves. Uh,
I thought of a good way of contextualizing this before we started filming, and I've been waiting to spring it on you.
okay.
Imagine, if you will, you are big rich neighbor, and big rich neighbor you has many people living on his street, and you're walking down the street one day, and no one's asking you for no money, no one's asking you for a cup of sugar, no one's asking for you to even look at them. But then you look at one poor, helpless, emaciated boy, and you realize, I don't like the way his face looks. So you throw him off a bridge. That's the type of people we're dealing with here. I think that's a good example.
Right, except instead of rich, they just had sharp knives.
Yep.
Lots and lots of sharp knives. Um, Sparta had a system of ruling, or divided its society into three levels. Ryan, I'm going to need your help on the terminology. I know the base layer is the helots, which are
Yep.
basically their slaves. They were slaves is a bit.
It's not exact. I think the closer term would be serfs, but they were definitely treated like slaves.
Yeah, it's like the in between of serf and slave. They were bound to the same land. They were bound to a specific plot of land, but because they were bound to the plot of land and because they were technically Sparta's property and not any individual's property, you didn't have to deal with them being traded, with families being split up, with that kind of thing. But if any helot got uppity, he would most likely die. And this was like legally sanctioned.
In, in fact,
They,
every we were talking about the campaigning seasons. Sparta every year declared war on the Helots.
yeah, they had a purge day for their helots.
I say Helots, you say Helots. It's fine. You say
What was I
tomato,
gonna
I
say?
say tomato.
It's actually, and they also had a coming of age tradition, which was to go out, find the strongest looking helot you could, and off him. That was a Spartan walkabout. That was a Spartan prom.
That was
Um,
your bar mitzvah.
to kind of This is kind of demonstrated in 300 when Leonidas kills the wolf. Except if it was more realistic, he wouldn't have killed a wolf. He would have killed a strong-looking Gila. That
He
would
would
have
he would
been
have he would have killed the hope of some Helot family where they fed their strongest child, hopefully so that he could work and make the money, and he in walks King Leonidas and just beheads him.
right. And no,
That's
didn't even necessarily have to have revolutionary aspirations. They were just like, little Bobby Brown is going to pick more corn than any other child we've ever had, and we're so proud of him. And then because he looks so strong, he gets killed. Um, and so that was the kind of system they lived on, and that was a mostly that was a system that they could run rather dynamically for a while, but then they bit off more than they could chew and took over the city state of Masenyan, which was to the west of them, I believe, in the Peloponnese. It
yeah.
was over a range of mountains.
It was
So
northwest.
northwest, okay. So it was over a range of mountains, so very difficult to get to for them. And when they took over Messenia, they made almost everyone they conquered automatically a helot. A few outbound city states, not city states, towns and villages that were part of the city state of Messenia became, and this is where I need your help. What's the middle stage of Spartan society?
I actually looked it up because I thought I knew it and I didn't want to seem like an asshole. It's the Perisiroi. Peri Periosi. Okay, yeah,
Perioeci.
Periosi. Periosi.
Uh, that, which was a middling stage in Spartan society. That's where most of their craftsmen came from. They could occasionally serve as soldiers, but
If they had money.
mostly they served. Mostly their role within Spartan society was to make stuff, mine stuff, that kind of stuff, that kind of thing. So that's the three stages of Sparta. And then the top stage is, of course, the Spartan Hoplites who
Your
run
kings,
around
your
killing everything.
equites. Yeah.
Where was it going? So, yeah, Sparta ends up with this huge kingdom of slaves very far away. And culturally, it's not in uh, um, kind of going back to Sinoism. Sparta culturally has a coming together attitude. Their hoplites, their Spartan citizens stay within Lacedaemonia for the most part. They have to go to their messes. That's how Spartans don't eat dinner in their home with their family. They eat with their messes with their troops, and that kind of creates a stronger bond amongst all the citizens. And there's like a lot of prestige in what mess you end up sitting with, kind of like high school, I suppose. You want to sit
Clicky.
with
It
the
gets very
cool kids.
clicky.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it gets very clicky. Um, you want to bring honor to your clique. Uh,
I just had a Mean Girls thought in my head. Don't do that to me. Come
yeah,
on.
Sparta is Mean Girls. um, but yeah, so they want, and they also don't want to miss their lunch break. They want to be with the boys at their mess, shooting the shit, discussing which helot their children are going to murder or whatever. Um, they don't want to be out in Messenia serving as an occupation force. There's no glory in that. There's no fun in that. So, and this kind of results in regular, like, generational warfare with the Messenians, where they'll rise up in revolt. Uh, One that took place not too far before the Persian War was the Second Masenyan Revolt. It took like 20 years. It was a very close thing for Sparta. They nearly lost it all. I think there was like an earthquake or something that destroyed Sparta partway through. There's just not a lot of good things happening for Sparta in that war, but at the last minute they take it and they're able to reimpose their brutal system. Um,
Brutal's a
and
nice word.
they realize that they're going to need help if they're going to act as a superpower on the global stage to what extent that exists, to like within the Greek world. They're going to need extra firepower from their neighbors, and of course their neighbors are all intimidated by them. They don't really, they maybe kind of recognize that Sparta is preoccupied, but nonetheless, even with its preoccupation, Sparta still poses a threat. And so a vast array of alliances start taking place with Sparta's immediate neighbors. And this becomes the framework for the first league, the Peloponnesian League. This one will continue. This one will serve as the basis for the league that defends against Persia and will continue straight through to the Peloponnesian Wars. It's going to, hence the name, it's going to be the league that Athens fights against, breaks away from, and then fights against, which story for another time. Um, and it continues through even past the Peloponnesian Wars.
So now that we have a good understanding of where the league, at least a general idea of where the leagues came from, I think it's a good idea to introduce our main source. Your boy.
We are very bad at this. This should have happened.
Hey, I was thinking it. I was trying, but you were on such a roll. I did not want to interrupt you. It's fine. It's fine. You know what?
Uh,
Honestly, it's okay. It's good. Now, so one of the places that a lot of this information comes from is from the man that's generally called the first historian, but I know Kane doesn't like that name.
the grandfather of history,
Okay. Okay.
um, which is I think acceptable because Thucydides does a way better job. Um, Herodotus, if you guys don't know, um, so Herodotus, I was supposed to have this written down. Herodotus exists about a generation or two out from the Persian Wars, from the subject he's written about. He's still able to get firsthand accounts of that war, but he wasn't an eyewitness to it. Um,
He's also
he's
writing with an agenda. That's clear. I mean, every historian, even the most unbiased ones, even we have an agenda here. That agenda is probably to make you laugh, but or I don't know what I don't know what Kane's planning. I don't live in his head. I really don't
uh,
want to live in his head. Um,
yeah, you
I
just
mean,
heard me like 30 minutes about the Peloponnesian League, and it doesn't matter. This can get cut. This was bad.
don't worry about it. So uh, uh, crap, lost my train of thought there. Um, Right. So,
Agendas.
yeah, Herodotus is writing with an agenda, and we understand his. Well, he's not Athenian. Technically, he's Ionian. Um, but he's writing for an Athenian audience or speaking for an Athenian audience because he memorized all. How many lines was it? Like
I wasn't counting them. There's like a. Oh,
it's big. It's pretty big. He memorized the whole thing and he would recite it by memory
yeah.
constantly. And one of the things we don't know is what if he changed the some of the things he said depending on who was listening. So it's really hard to nail down exactly what has happened, but it's still a really valuable source because we can discern a lot of things from it, and some of the things we can discern we know if they're truthful or not. For example, he writes down as this is one of Kane's favorite moments. Uh, the hippos or crocodiles, excuse me, the crocodiles in
No, it was hippos.
it was hippos. Okay. How does he describe them? Because I love the way you do this.
Okay, so Herodotus likes to go on very long tangents, very useful tangents, on what he understands about the world, and he dedicates an entire book to Egypt. And while he's going through, like, an entire segment of his history is about Egypt. Um, and he covers everything. He gives you the lineage of the pharaohs. He talks to you about the skull thickness of their people and how that compares to Persia. Uh, the Egyptians have incredibly thick skulls, in case you were wondering. The sun made it so. The weak Persians wear helmets, so their heads crumble to dust after a generation. Um, oh, he went to a battlefield to confirm this allegedly. Um, he discusses the tides of the Nile and why it floods when it does. It's because the sun gets very close to Egypt on certain seasons. Um, and he discusses the mating habits of the fish in the Nile to kind of give you an idea of what detail he goes into. Uh, all of this, you kind of begin to realize is he's full of shit. He has not been to Egypt. Nothing makes this more clear than when he talks about hippos. Um, the word hippopotamus comes from Greek, actually,
It
and
literally means river horse.
yeah, it means river horse. And seeing that word, Herodotus logically deduced that that must mean that hippopotamuses have long flowing manes, have hooved feet, probably neigh as they gallop through the river. Um,
Oh my god.
Having no idea of the terror that is a real hippopotamus.
Hey, more
And
people die a year from hippos than lions. Just saying that.
yeah, so that begs the question, Greece, what is your excuse for taking so long to develop? I mean, Egypt was able to become a flourishing empire long before them, and they had to fight hippos to get there.
They also have the Nile Basin.
Or does that just confirm the idea because they had a harder upbringing, they were able to become so powerful so quickly? These are the
You know what?
questions we ask.
It's a good thing we don't have a time machine. We would get speared.
But yeah, Herodotus as a source is incredibly interesting because he gives is incredibly interesting and also incredibly frustrating because he gives an eyewitness a view into not only the histories as he calls them um, that he's discussing, but also his own how Greeks perceive the world, or at least how certain Greeks perceive the world when he was alive. He has a variety of interesting um, to call them biases would be maybe too heavy of an accusation, but points from which biases could arise. So he's from the city-state of Halicarnassus.
Yes, he's from Halicarnassus, yeah.
Which is an Ionian city-state, as was brought up earlier. So probably doesn't look too favorably on the Persians. He spends a lot of time in Athens. He spends a lot of time performing his histories to the Athenians, which leads to certain
Well, I mean, he frames the whole thing as from the viewpoint of an Athenian, even though he's Ionian. And he always speaks of the Spartans as, well, not the other because they're Greek, but as different. They're not they're clearly not the same as you good Athenians because they're fine with having a king.
right. Um, he yeah. The Spartans are like the stable superpower that already exists within Greece, and then this kind of showcases what's the word for it? Athens is really rookie of the year in Persia in his the histories of the Persian Wars, and beyond these like implicit biases of who he's performing to and where he's from, there's also explicitly stated biases. He's not writing the histories for what we would want. He's not writing the histories of the leagues, which we could then take whole paragraphs out of his book and just present and read them to you guys, and that would be the end of the podcast. No, he wants to capture the great deeds done by Greek and barbarian alike. He's coming from a tradition of epic poetry. Being the grandfather of history, he doesn't have a history book to look to copy, so he instead copies the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that's where he kind of frames his story around. In that sense, Herodotus's The Histories is an in-between point between a text like Homer's Iliad and Thucydides' the Peloponnesian Wars. And so while we may have preferred that he talked more about diplomacy and geography and topography and military strategy and other such things that interest us contemporary people, he presumed everyone already knew about them and just wanted to talk about the epic cool things that people were doing, the one-liners that were given, the tricks and ne'er-do and daring do of the variety of protagonists that he's highlighted. We don't get an understanding of the development of Athens as a naval power. Instead, we get one guy coming up with the idea, hey, Athens should be a naval power.
And that's pretty much how it's thought of now.
And that does taint our contemporary sources. It's also worth noting that the time period Herodotus is writing in is in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, an era in which Greeks were killing Greeks while Persia funded it. So you can kind of see this story as, hey, what are we doing? Remember this? Remember what we used to be capable of? Why aren't we going back to that? This was a better time.
But that's also a common theme in Greek history as a whole in the classics, where Rome being the exception, of course, where the Greeks would always look at the structures of the ancients and be like, Jesus Christ, we're pathetic. When they constantly would look at like the palace at Carnosus, for example, they'd look at that and be and think to themselves, if the people before us could do this and we're living in mud hovels, wow. Right? Like it's
every generation was worse off than the last.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to go into the starting of the Persian Wars. At least I don't know. I think we can get through a good chunk of the Persian Wars in 10 minutes and explaining the Greek idea of the other. That's something that's really important to understand about the Greeks is they had a very strong sense of who was Greek. Kane, you made a beautiful point before about the reason why some Greeks, not all, jumped to help at the Athenians, and even then, the Spartans wanted to. They probably wanted to, but again, when you're, I'm thinking of the meme with the dog where everything's on fire. This is fine, you know. I'm thinking of that. Which is just the Hellenic helmet on it.
Yeah.
Um, like I said, they had a very strong sense of who was Greek, but that means they had a very strong sense of who wasn't, with the one exception being Macedon, and that's something we're going to touch on in the next episode a little bit, not much, just a little bit, because it's also important to understand where Macedon fits into this giant puzzle. Um, so knowing who is and who isn't Greek is super important because, as Kane kept bringing up, Herodotus was saying like, oh yeah, the Egyptians are like this, where and the Persians have soft skulls, or weak skulls. So what happened is you get this overwhelming feeling of, yeah, I may hate, if I'm a Spartan, I may hate those Athenians, across the Isthmus of Corinth, but they're Greek,
Right.
and they speak the same language as me. They believe the same things I believe. We, as you said before, we participate in the same games. We
We fight
trade.
naked.
The number one thing that Greece has given to us is naked combat. It's ideal. Um,
I mean, just
so
look
what?
at their statues.
Perfection.
Um, but yeah, kind of jumping off that point. So we started with a discussion of the nebulous beginnings of um, of the leagues taking place in Sparta. But what really concretized it, what really turned it from just being Sparta's weird geopolitical way of staying relevant, was the Persian invasion. Suddenly, you have this barbarian other that's posing an existential threat to all Greeks, and this common Greek identity kind of caused a certain reverberation of like familiarity. Who knows how much this actually happened? This may just be Herodotus making a connection. Maybe many Greeks thought it, but you suddenly have this enemy in the east that the Greeks need to unite around to defeat. This echoes the Trojan War, which is another time where the Greeks united to fight a common enemy. And so this kind of creates this, puts it in the cultural imagination that the Greeks can just unite to fight an enemy. They can put their differences aside. They can have a common bond to fight against this clearly defined other, this other that wears clothes when they fight, this other that uses bows instead of fighting with their spears and shields like a man, that is effeminate as opposed to the more masculine Greek. All these different constructions get made to separate and elevate the Greeks amongst each other. And so this kind of gives, on top of the existential threat, permission for the league structure to take place, and is something that kind of makes the league structure different from other just plain alliances between different city-states or between different political entities.
No, that's an excellent point. I mean, hell, the word barbarian comes from how the Greeks understand the Persians talking. I'm not even sure the word that it's based on, but the Persians, the Greeks would always hear the word barbaroi coming from a barbar, excuse me, barbar, and they took that as barbaroi, and then they just barbarian. That's where the word comes from. So barbarian just literally means other. That's all it means. It means someone who is not us. So
Right. And it's worth stressing when Herodotus wrote his book that he wanted to highlight the glories and good deeds of both the Greeks and the barbarians. It doesn't have the loaded negative connotation per se, or didn't, that we have today of that term. The barbarian was just the not Greek. They were equally capable of being epic. They were just under the yoke of the Persians. And that was for the case of the Persian Wars and what makes the league system so prominent in the Greek imagination, um, under Persian imperium, you were enslaved. The Ionians were under the yoke of the Persians. They were oppressed. If you were in the Greek League alliance, you were free. Obviously, just ask a Spartan helot.
Look at how much they're loving their freedom, having war declared on them every fucking summer.
Look at how freely that helot is having the dagger shoved into his stomach.
His face being pushed into the mud by the sandal of his Spartan overlord.
That's
How great it is to live in Peloponnesia.
A sandal of freedom crushing his face.
Oh my god. Don't worry, hell, it's freedom's on its way.
It kind of is that American, that meme of America dropping democracy onto other countries. It kind of, it rings that way in a certain sense.
I mean, we're kind of forcing it to, but yeah, it really does. But that's another thing too. It's really easy to see how these overwhelming numbers force these groups that don't necessarily like each other, but can identify that, well, we're both against this, and even that it's more than that. It's not the Allies and the USSR in World War II. It's more than that. It's you are my brother. I am going to help you. I may disagree with you from time to time, but you are my brother. And I know I'm jumping ahead here, but we can see that after the end of the Peloponnesian War. Spoiler alert: Sparta wins. And
I just started the book, man.
I'm sorry. And we can see that the Spartans are really uncomfortable with the idea of Sparta absolutely destroying Athens. And their argument is that no, they're Greek, they've done good things, leave them be. We've won, that's the end of it. Well, that's the end of it, type of thing. So yeah, this whole idea of we're Greek, they're Greek, we're all Greek. My headphones just went crazy. It really permeates through the whole thing, and it's really interesting to see how they come together in the face of this overwhelming enemy. And anyone who's seen the movie 300, I'm not gonna lie, I haven't seen it. I don't plan on it. Anyone who's seen that will at least be familiar. You're shaking your head, man.
You should check it out. It just for comparison's sake, it's so fun.
Okay, I believe it. But you'll at least be somewhat familiar with what was going on. By the way, it wasn't 300 Spartans. It was 300 Spartans plus 6,000 allies. Granted, it was the most trusted allies of the Greeks, and they sent, what was it, over 20,000 back to Athens because they realized we're fucked.
To actually
like that.
to discuss that more broadly, but still get it done quickly because I know we're pressed for time here. Just so that we keep a running narrative going, Sardis gets burnt down. Remember that 40 minutes ago?
I do.
Back on that. Sardis gets burnt down. The Persians are very upset about that. One of their temples gets burnt down. I keep stressing that, and I'm not entirely sure. I probably should stop doing that. But let's just say it happened. Herodotus invented enough stuff. What's one more thing?
I mean, he invented literal friggin' river horses. So,
Sardis gets burnt down. Temple gets burnt down. Persia's upset. They crush every Ionian city-state that they can get their hands on, which is all of them. But Athens gets away, and Darius knows who's the emperor of Persia at this time.
Before Xerxes.
Knows that Athens, got away, contributed to the Ionian Revolt, and then left, and intends them to not get away with it scot-free. But he has a bunch of other things to deal with for a bit. His whole empire needs him. There's revolts going on, so he has to go deal with those revolts. But he has a slave picked for him explicitly to remind him every single day of what the Athenians did. Because Athens is such a tiny city-state, why would he know it otherwise? At least this is, again, what Herodotus tells us. I think it's fun. We'll keep it. And so eventually...
It sounds good.
Eventually, he deals with what he has to deal with and creates a small expeditionary force to make the Greeks bend the knee, or more explicitly to the symbols that existed in that time, to give them earth and water. Yeah. So they march through the Greek world, collecting earth and water. They have to fight a few battles. Athens and Sparta do agree to an uneasy alliance in this case. Did I say Athens and Sparta?
Yes, you did.
Okay, cool. I thought for a second I said Athens and Persia.
No worries, you're good. Keep going.
Athens and Sparta allied each other. It's an uneasy alliance. It's a tenuous alliance. It ends up happening that at this great battle at Marathon, Athens stands alone against Persia. Now, this isn't an overwhelming Persian force. It's just an expeditionary force. It is readily defeated through a bit of luck, a bit of conniving, and a bit of strategy.
Also, surprising, heavy infantry does really well against unarmored men.
That's true. That does help.
Shocker.
The Persians retreat to their ships and attempt to beat the Athenian army to Athens to take it over. There is this miracle march in which the Athenians march day and night. Who knows how it happened? Herodotus doesn't go into any details, the asshole. And by some miracle, the Athenians beat the Persians to Athens and are there to stop the Persians from disembarking. So the whole expedition ends, and that's the First Persian War. Shortly after, Sparta arrives to help.
The bastards.
Athens is like, you guys are late. And they're like, yeah, well, Helix. We had to put them down. We had to put them in the kennel before we left.
They're doing hellish things.
And so Athens is like, no, the war's over. We won. Sparta doesn't believe them. Athens shows them the battlefield. The Spartans are duly impressed. It's worth noting that Athens is newly democratic at this point. I brought this up a bit earlier, but Herodotus stresses this because he believes that while under tyranny, Athens underperformed as a city-state. It was just a middling city-state. But because it was free, and this kind of deals with the theme of the broader story of free Greeks versus enslaved Persians, because Athens was free, because it was the pinnacle of freedom, it could suddenly punch way above its weight because they all felt that they had a duty to the city. So Darius is pissed off that his small expeditionary force got rebuffed, but he's not worried about it. He's the frickin' emperor of Persia. And he plans to really show the Greeks what he's capable of, begins gathering a massive army, but then Egypt revolts, and he has to go deal with that.
Thankfully, he built up a massive army. That's
thankfully he had that ready. He just had to turn it around.
I mean, or is this more like, damn, I was saving my money for a new bike, but I really need food this week.
Yeah, it was more that, especially with his time-wise, because he goes to Egypt. This ends up taking the rest of his life. Darius dies. He can't do it. Xerxes comes to the throne. He's like, I'm going to do that thing that Dad wanted to do. And so he continues gathering this massive force. Herodotus claims that it's 5 million men strong. I think Zach Schneider says it's 1 million men strong.
I'm gonna go with the safer bet, under 500,000.
Yeah, most historians say probably 180,000.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to say. I'm just gonna say under 500,000.
Honestly, even 500,000 would be a titanic force.
Oh yeah, that's insane.
Athens, the city of Athens at its height, I think had something like 40,000 people in it.
Yeah, no, that is enough to drink rivers dry.
Yeah. Which consequently is what they're attested to have done on multiple occasions. And honestly, this is awe-inspiring. This is impressive. This is duly epic. Herodotus definitely wants to take note of this. But it's also kind of stupid, as we described at the opening of this. Greece is not a particularly fertile area. It can't really support an additional 100,000 to 500,000 people. This is just not great logistics. So in order to do this, Xerxes needs to keep his fleet very close to him, and he needs to march very close to the coast in order to get regular resupplies, because he's rivers are going dry. He can't even, there's not even enough water.
He also can't be screwed over by people that are letting him pass through his lands with his army. Macedon.
Right. And the issue with keeping this fleet constantly resupplying him, and because I had to speed through, I forgot to mention earlier, there's a naval catastrophe that makes a prequel to the first invasion, impossible. There was supposed to be a naval invasion, it got crushed. Um, Darius tried again, that got crushed. And now Xerxes is trying with his massive fleet and his massive army. In the opening stages of that war, there's another storm which does massive damage to the Persian fleet. It seems as though the gods really don't like the Persians hubristically going beyond Asia. Asia is supposed to be for the Persians. They're not supposed to also have Europe. Um, but they're trying it anyway. There's this naval disaster. A bunch of ships are destroyed. Xerxes walks down to the famous pass at Thermopylae, which you brought up. There were 300 Spartans, as well as a variety of other people there to help.
Still epic.
They fight for a couple days. They're betrayed by the Thebans, who really don't come across well. I think it was the Thebans. It may have been someone from Boeotia.
No, I'm pretty sure it was the Thebans. It was I'm pretty sure it was a Theban. What's the word? Shepherd. Thank you.
Yeah, something to that effect shows a way around the Greeks so that they could be flanked. When it becomes obvious that their position is no longer tenable, everyone except the 300 the 300 Spartans retreats, and the 300 Spartans fight to their death. The reason they do this is because it's a staple of Spartan lore that you do not retreat. You stay at your post. Probably a little dumb.
A little? I mean, Spartan mothers would send their children off to war, and because they would be the one to present them with the Hoplon shield, and they would tell their children with it or on it. So you're coming back with your shield, or you're dead on it.
Yeah, and there are a few Spartans that survive this battle for a variety of like unlucky reasons. You know, one of them is running a message, he gets back, and oh my god, they're all dead. So he goes home and tries to plead for his life, and they're like, no, you've dishonored yourself, you should have died with them. And he's like, but I was doing something else.
The king sent me over here. But the whole point is that is something that's ingrained in the ethos to this day, where the Spartans get in my opinion, an undeservedly badass reputation. Don't get me wrong, they are like, you know, mythical warriors, but they're not on the level that everyone puts them up to be. And maybe we'll get into that. But for now, one of the things that's really important to understand is that after this battle, the Persians kept pushing on. They didn't leave. Right. They kept pushing right to Athens, and this is where we get the big climax of the war. Thermopylae was not the climax. The climax was the siege of Athens.
Yeah, so it's worth noting this is considered like the staying action. It's an inconclusive action on both parts. There's a parallel sea battle that takes place at Artemisium.
Yep.
Artemisium. Both the Greek fleet and the Greek army really does well, but because of certain circumstances, they're forced to retreat. So technically, it's a Persian victory. The Persians then move on down into Athens. Athens realizes that its entire kingdom is no longer tenable, so it has to retreat. And this is kind of where the league system as it exists becomes important. Athens takes to its ships. The entire city-state is either evacuated to the island of Salamis.
Yes,
Salamis.
Baloney.
So they evacuate to either a tiny island or are all on their fleet. And then this is where the dichotomy of the Spartans with their army and the Athenians with their fleet really becomes most apparent. The Spartans want to retreat to behind a wall that they've built, cutting off Peloponnesia, which is this like outcrop of land where Sparta exists. There's a very narrow spit of land near about Corinth that is very easily cut off, so they could stop the Persian army from getting there. But Athens is quick and often repeats that Persia also has a fleet, and if you don't act offensively to retake Athens, we will leave you and you will be victims of the harrying from the Persian fleet. The Persian will be able to land marines anywhere on Peloponnesia, essentially. So Sparta can't hide behind its wall because it needs Athens to stay and fight. Uh, showing
And
the
Sparta didn't even have walls.
right, yeah, showing Athens' utility. Um, there's a huge naval battle at near Salamis, where the Persian fleet takes a savage beating and is forced to retreat to an island in the Aegean. Xerxes is like sitting on the shore watching this defeat happen, realizes that he is massively overexerted himself. The cost of this campaign is unnecessarily large. So he leaves for the winter. He takes most of his army. He leaves allegedly 200,000 with his lieutenant in Greece to finish the war for him. Most likely it was like 20,000,
if that.
maybe less. And then they all take the winter off because this is seasonal warfare. The next year, the Persians again try and woo the Greeks to take the yoke. Persia offers to completely finance the reconstruction of Athens in any way they want if they will just give, I keep wanting to say bread and water. It's earth and water.
Yeah.
And I think this is itself pretty interesting. From the Greek perspective, their idea, like we in our nation state oriented world kind of worship the land we stand on. The land is the country to a large extent. If any land is lost, this is considered a personal loss. At this point, Persia had Athens for all intents and purposes. It just didn't have the people. And in the Greek imagination, that's where the value was. Greeks had no problem yeeting out of their city, going to like somewhere on the coast of Italy and setting up shop there and just like moving around to that extent because the polis was in the people.
Yeah.
So the Persians again try and woo the Athenians back on side because they realize their fleet kicks ass and they want that. The Athenians say no. There's a massive battle at a place called Plataea. The Persians are finally defeated. They retreat as much as they can back to like they are kicked all the way out of the Greek lands. They go all the way back to Asia. Macedon is freed. Northern Greece is freed.
Ionia is free.
Ionia is free.
Sort of.
There is like that becomes tenuous.
It's kind of like a buffer state.
But yeah, it is mostly at this point freed from the yoke of the Persians. I think this is where we should stop the narrative. I think the uneasy middle zone up to the peace of
Calais.
The peace of Calais we can discuss next episode.
Yep, that sounds like a great idea to me. So today, in our first episode of Untitled Podcast, we've gone way deeper.
History podcast.
Yeah, Untitled History Podcast. We've gone deeper than I initially expected to. I hope you feel satisfied with how this has gone because I love this. I think this is great.
I covered everything I wanted to say. I didn't realize just how long it was going to be. I deeply apologize to whatever audience is listening. Next time, I swear I will keep it to 60 minutes.
It's all good. It's all good. So I hope you've enjoyed this ride. So from Kane and I, is there any last words you want to say?
I want to apologize again. I'm so sorry.
Ah, man. Well, I hope that you'll join us again next time. And I hope you learned a great deal because Kane and I both learned that Parmesan is very stinky. Bye now.